Welcome back to the program. We are joined today by Sean Fu, a financial analyst and a China expert, to discuss some of the supply chain wars and, well, wider economic war going on. So thank you for taking the time.
Sure, great to be here.
So there's lots of things happening in the current economic war. Last time we focused mostly around China and the United States, and I do want to get back to this, but Europe has been popping up in the headlines as well, um, given the sanctions on Russia. But I thought this could be a good place to start because it it seems now that Donald Trump has gone through sanctioning Russia's two major oil companies, which is quite an interesting step because he had been cautious about sanctioning Russia simply because he wanted to improve relations with Russia. At least that's what he said. And even Joe Biden himself didn't want to sanction these Russian oil companies, given part of the reason, not his good nature, but if you sanction the oil companies, the oil price goes up, and whatever exports the Russians miss out on would be made back in terms of higher prices. This was his main concern. So
Right.
the West would be punished and Russia would be unaffected. Again, one shouldn't dismiss the severity of these sanctions. So I wanted to ask you then, how do you assess the consequence for this? Because it is primarily secondary sanctions this is about. So these are sanctions on China, India, and others for continuing to buy the oil from Russia, which they more or less have to buy. Is this correct?
Yes, more or less. I guess that Trump right now he's under a very big squeeze, a double squeeze. And the entire US economy, the entire trade war is predicated on getting the edge against China. I think we all talk over the past few months, even to the last 12 months, that the US cannot fight economic wars and physical wars in different fronts. You can't, confront China when you are fighting, you are helping Israel. You can't really focus on China if you're all the way in the Eastern Front helping Ukraine. So, what Trump is doing right now is to extricate himself, extricate the US from all these um, different confrontations in order to focus on China. But the big problem here is that China has played quite a few cards that has shocked the administration over the past few months. I think three big cards were played. The first thing was not buying any soybean exports from US farmers. That's a big one. The second one is the rare earths card. China is basically not going to supply the United States with rare earths. And the problem with this is now China can actually tell countries that use the rare earths that if you're using our components, we have the right to dictate or at least influence whether you can sell components to Americans. So this is actually freaking Trump out as well. And on the other hand, China, they have reduced their American energy imports all the way to zero. So we're talking about no LNG, we're talking about no coal, and we're talking about no crude oil as well. So if we look at the sanctions on Russia from a purely economic perspective, there is the short-term agenda and there's the long-term agenda. Now, if you manage to coerce the world to stop buying um, oil from Putin, it's going to be obvious what the effects will be for the US. Oil prices go up, which it did. It went up by 7%. And this actually helped stem the fall in oil prices when American producers, they are suffering, right? China's not buying from them. Their cost of production is very high. So Trump, in effect, is trying to save American oil producers as well. And now that the world is being coerced to a point that you can't buy oil from Rosneft, you can't buy oil from Lukoil, these are the two major Russian producers, the two major Russian exporters. Where else are you going to get it from? Right? Right now, the Europeans, they have no choice but to get it from the United States. And there are even rumors that India, they're cutting back supply as well. So this is a bit of a ploy in order to save the American oil industry, to allow Trump to actually export more American energy to the world. Now, that's on the short term end of the spectrum. When we look at the longer agenda, Trump wants the war with Russia to end, right? Not really because it's altruistic. It was because back in March and April, I think we remembered that the Russians, Putin, they were just casually discussing rare earths projects with the Americans, right? But how are you going to do that if there's a physical war, there's a kinetic war going on in Ukraine? You can't. And if we look at Trump's statements, he's quite happy to allow the Russians to, capture or integrate whatever land they have all the way to the borders of the front wherever they are now, which means any rare earths, if there are under the Ukrainian territory, will be under the Russians. So what Trump wants to do is also to break away from Chinese dependency of rare earths as in a way to work with the Russians to develop the resources under the ground. So that more or less is the long-term agenda as well.
How are the Chinese though planning to adjust to this? Because there are some, um, especially on the gas, given that there are gas pipelines, oil pipelines, it's going to be very difficult to police for the world policemen some of this trade. It's going to be easier with India, of course, given that the Russians use ship. Again, the Western countries more or less look to criminalize this, which is, you read it into the language. All journalists have to refer to this as a shadow fleet, this kind of usual branding. Um, but but when we had Biden, I meant a lot of the sanctions on Russia has and actions against Russia has a very heavy Chinese component to it. That is, under the Biden administration, you had all these top officials on a regular basis explaining why this was a brilliant war. For example, Keith Kellogg, he was very open saying that this was, a brilliant war. He compared it to Sun Tzu because he argued, we're using the Ukrainians to knock out Russia as a strategic rival, and if we can kick it out of the ranks of great powers, then the United States can focus all its resources on countering China. So this was the brilliance of it. But instead, of course, we saw China and Russia getting closer together, and Trump, overall, the same objective is there. But he thought initially, let's get Russia over on our side of the ledger. We can make them split a bit from China. And again, China is also a key component of this war. But given how much depends on China or the China focus, how do you expect China to respond to this? Because if my impression was that Beijing more or less understood, if the Russians can be broken, then China's next on the chopping board.
Sure. I guess there are two ways we can look at it. Firstly, I don't believe the Americans can immediately confront China. If we are saying that Trump's going to go all the way, pedal to the metal, that would mean kicking out a lot of Chinese banks, a lot of Chinese oil refiners from the global system, right? And we kind of know the drill. That means potentially confiscating their assets, potentially kicking them out from the SWIFT system. And once again, you can't use the dollar whales payment system. Now, if that were to happen, it would instantly break global trade. And whatever disaster we saw over the last 6 months is just going to be magnified 5 to 10 times worse. And on the other hand, well, the Chinese is not really going to risk that as well. So they're just going to simply play a game of whack-a-mole with the Americans, with Trump, the same way they did it over the last 2 to 3 years with the Biden administration. Now, the thing is that you are trying to target two Pacific oil companies, right? Rosneft and Lukoil. What's stopping them from creating intermediaries where Lukoil and Rosneft, they can sell their cargo to this company, and this company sells to the rest of Asia? And on China as well, they can always open up their own intermediary subsidies or shell companies in order to take in the Russian volumes. So unless the Trump administration does a full-on economic embargo or confrontation with the entire Chinese economy, all these can be bypassed. And we have seen since 2022, 23, and 24, there's been a lot of shadow fleets, as you talked about, a lot of independent traders, companies that would happily take on the risk. They will buy Russian oil at a huge discount, and then they sell it to other countries. And of course, one of the recipient countries is China. And the margins are so big that they're willing to take the risk. And when it comes to the sanctions, we have to understand that China and Russia, they are in such close proximity. Even if you were to transport cargo from eastern Russia all the way, swing past Japan, down South Korea to China, it's still a short distance that Chinese ships they'll be able to do the voyage quite risk-free. Insurers they don't really need to use, for example, Lloyd's of London or all of the Western insurers. They can just do it in-house using Chinese insurance. So I don't think this is going to be much of a logistical or even a financial problem for the Chinese. It's just going to be a big hassle and one big game of whack-a-mole.
It's interesting what you said about the insurance because in this economic war, it keeps s- spreading, branching out. That is, if you can't use Western ports, use different ports. If you can't use a currency, if you can't use the banks, slowly this is all creating incentives to create a new economic architecture. And the insurances are, of course, the new thing because the West, especially British, have almost monopolized on this area. But now, by necessity, of course, uh, there's a diversification in this area as well. Um, the oil though, it's interesting because if there's money to be made, there's always a way to circumvent. But we saw that the Germans they were actually the first ones begging the United States to get exemptions, which is well, in the world of politics, amusing because the Europeans are some of the most hawkish, strongest advocates for escalating the war on Russia, and they also want more sanctions from the US. But of course, once the US sanctions the Russian oil, Germany discovers that some of its largest refineries are are actually Russian and on their soil, and this is very problematic. So, do you think the Europeans will be spared? Because, as you said, increased oil prices could save American producers, but the Europeans, they are consumers, they are purchasers. They're just gonna get hammered by this.
Well, I'm not exactly sure what Trump is going to do, right? I mean, he's so mercurial, we have no idea. But the Europeans, they're really caught in a double bind, and the West is also really caught in a very the optics just looks very bad. So let's say Trump actually gives Germany the exemption, right? Yeah, you can refine whatever oil in the Rosneft refineries, and we won't punish you. The rest of the world can still buy from you, and other German companies or other EU companies can still get the oil products, gasoline, kerosene, plastic feedstocks, and fertilizer feedstocks. But what does that essentially do? It says there are two rule books in the world, one for the United States and their allies slash partners, and one essentially for the rest of the world, or you can call them the global south or the global majority of BRICS. And this will just bifurcate the world into bigger blocks. Because if you're trying to impose this kind of global punishment, it has to be global. It has to be regardless of what country you are, whether it's Germany, whether it's Zimbabwe, whether it's whether it's Thailand, whether it's China, it has to be globally broad based. But if you were to do it in such a heavy handed way, where the rest of the world gets punished except for your allies, then it really confuses everyone. And we'll just see the whole world split more into collective blocks. BRICS, they will start dealing more amongst themselves. Eventually, the Russian flows will still go to BRICS. And then the Europeans, they'll be trapped buying American, LNG, American energy, because at least in my speculation, if Trump were to allow the Rosneft refineries to escape the punishments to exemptions, chances are the Americans will want the inputs, the oil, the crude oil, to be American energy. It only makes sense for Trump if he were to get this exemption. So Germany is really caught in a quite a bit of a double bind here.
This does seem, though, that the geoeconomic strategy of the Americans might be that countries who subordinate themselves or submit do as they're told, that they would get one set of rules, and countries who fail, they will get a second. So, yes, a way of restoring the American empire. But But for the Europeans, though, this is quite a horrible situation, not just with the Russians, but also with the Chinese. Because if you're in the United States, it seems what you want to do is build your geoeconomic blocks, that is, get full loyalty from your vassals and make sure that they cut themselves off from your rival, which is China. And at the moment, no one's really more obedient than the Europeans. And I think we spoke last time about Nexperia. That's a great case study of this. Um, how is this developing now? Because last I saw, uh, the seizing of Nexperia is now causing European car companies, especially German, again, for some
Right.
reason Germany keeps getting hammered here, to cut massive production. And I saw the German foreign minister flying to China, or planning to fly to China, but nobody wants to meet him. Well, well, again, the world has changed very radically in a very few years. How are you assessing this situation?
Well, I think the Netherlands really made quite a bit of a critical error. There's a lot of speculation that the Dutch minister did it of his own accord. The Dutch government thought independently, but we have other reports, like, I guess it was the Wall Street Journal saying that maybe the Americans had a hand in it, right? So we don't know. But the big question now is that why would you want to antagonize the Chinese when you know there's a rare earth confrontation going on between China and the collective West, especially the United States? Now, the problem with this is that it will only accelerate China to create their own semiconductor supply chain, right? China, they have no choice right now but to build everything in house. One of the big reasons that Nexperia was actually China actually invested into Nexperia and started building chips within the Netherlands itself is because of all the advanced lithography machines. You can actually access it there, and the chip ecosystem in the Netherlands is quite good as well. But the problem is that if you start going around taking control of Chinese companies suddenly, and now China faces the possibility of a cutoff of the supply of chips in Netherlands all the way to China, because it goes all the way there to get finished and get repackaged before shipping out to the rest of the Chinese people. If that happens, what is the incentive of China to actually build more factories in the Netherlands or to build more factories in the EU? Because if it could happen in Holland, it could always be replicated across the rest of the entire EU bloc, right? Maybe not Hungary, but you know, other countries could also take these kind of actions. This will only embolden China to just double down on semiconductor, um, their own development. And I don't think the Chinese, they're gonna forget this very easily. So we'll come to a point of time where Chinese chips eventually catch up with the Americans. Then Europe will be in another double bind. Will they be forced to buy only expensive American chips? And even will the Chinese be willing to sell them affordable chips in the future? So the Xperia experience is not really a good experience for China.
It's still amazing. Well, on that trip, I mean, it was only one thing he was there to do. Try to find a way of getting the chips. It would be fine. But just to go through what happens. The Dutch government first seizes control over Chinese company in Netherlands, creates the chips. China responds by, well, if this is more or less seized or occupied territory, to use that language, we're not gonna, our subsidiaries aren't gonna send any more to the main office in Netherlands. So now there's a the chips are drying up, and the whole point of this thing was to have a chip security, wasn't it? Secure supply chains. And now suddenly there's a massive shortage, and yeah, the German car industries go under, well, not completely under, but they have to reduce their production significantly. There's a massive shortage. They don't know what to do. So the German foreign minister goes to China, and on his agenda is not only to try to fix this, but that would imply through Chinese concessions, because he should have boarded a flight to Netherlands, in my opinion, and reversed some of this, but he didn't. But also on the plan is, also tell the Chinese they should stop trading with Russia, and like a list of demands. It doesn't seem they quite appreciated how the shift in power has, I guess, changed the relationship here. But it's no, it's a, it's hard to believe this is actually real. But there seems to be some delusional thinking going on. Um, but but in the United States as well, how do you read the economic, well, development, or um, the buildup of bubbles, the investments we have in different AI that's not performing as expected? Do you see the US also getting into deep trouble here?
I think that both the US and China, they have seen what the future battlefront will be, right? It will be chips, it will be semiconductors, and it will be AI. Now, the US and China, they're doing two very different approaches. China is doing it very domestically. They are using a lot of the trade surplus, a lot of their local talent. They're trying to do it sustainably, right? So the Chinese approach to AI more or less is create good enough models so that you can actually use it in the real world, right? Maybe you're using it to power more of your hospitals. Maybe you're using it to develop new technology, self-driving car systems for the BYD vehicles, and then the revenue you get from there, it starts cycling back into AI. So it's like a self-sustaining business. But the Americans know that they don't really have much of an industrial manufacturing base, unlike China. So China is the world's factory, as we all know, and they can use it as a kind of supercharger for all the AI tech to boost up their manufacturing. The manufacturing booms even more, and then the trade surplus gets cycled back into AI. Now, the Americans don't have that. So, but what the Americans have, for better or worse, is the big Wall Street capital system. They have the ability, through the US dollar and the depth of their capital markets, to tell the whole world to invest into the United States, invest into US AI. And that's why a few months back, maybe in March or April, Trump came out with this, scary Project Stargate, $500 billion invested into American AI. And that's why we are seeing a lot of these companies like OpenAI investing into Oracle, Oracle investing back into Nvidia. So it's one big cash cycling game going on. And that's why we are seeing a lot of this bubbles getting bigger, getting bigger. For example, Oracle, their share price rose by 30%, which is, I guess, a third of $1 trillion just suddenly went up. But when you look into the details, it's like their customers, OpenAI, they're fueling it through a lot of debt. And if the United States wants to make this sustainable, that would mean they need to knock out China out of the AI game, or else there won't be enough global demand in the world in order to fuel the US bubble, in order to justify the valuations, in order to justify the revenue. So if we look at the entire United States game against China when it comes to AI, they're firing on all cylinders. That's why we have the AI semiconductor curbs. That's why China is also trying to respond by not denying Nvidia of Chinese revenue. And it's also another big reason why Trump is desperately trying to get interest rates down. He wants the entire American system, American companies, US big tech to have enough money to afford to borrow to keep fueling the system. So it's one big bet. And as it stands, right, it's a bit of a coin flip right now.
I remember under the Obama administration when during the global financial crisis he wanted to choose to who to bail out. So there was a massive uproar, especially among the Republicans, that it's not in the role of the government to decide which companies stay afloat and which collapse. But under Trump, this has gone to a different level. The U.S.'s government is becoming now a co-owner of of this chip companies, and this is quite, for from the American experience, this is quite unique. Do you see all of this as being linked into the desperation in the United States? Because, as you said, um, if a lot of these AI programs are now being built, on losses, they're not sustaining themselves. Everything is a jeopardy. If there's no income, if there's not sufficient income, there's no research and development. The debt increases, they build up bubbles. This is very much unsustainable. The key tactic for China is simply to keep on going, and time will, I guess, take care of all of these problems on their own.
Yeah, I guess Trump is now embarking on a very big experiment, which is the US government going around buying equity stakes, buying stocks of companies in order to shore up their supply chains. Now, what Trump is trying to do is that he's trying to out Chinese the Chinese, right? I mean, the American capitalist system worked in a sense if it's done correctly, but now you're trying to move towards a model that China has mastered over the last 10, 20, 30 years of subsidizing their own um, companies. And China does it not really through debt and deficits, although they do have it, it's mainly through their earnings from all their exports, the trade surplus. And it can be done in a more sustainable way. Let's not forget that Chinese bond yields are still sub 2%. It's below that. However, US bond yields, the 10-year, is still well over 4%. So the cost of borrowing is double. But there's another fundamental problem when it comes to all these supply chains going around discussing with the Australians, we want to get rare earths out from the ground. Now, the big problem is that I made a joke a few videos before that Trump can suddenly conjure up all the rare earths in the world. He can get the genie from Aladdin to create all the rare earths to just pop up in the Arizona desert. It still doesn't, it just won't matter because it's all about the refining of rare earths. And one country has pure dominance over it. 90 to 95% is in China because they do it during a time where costs were low, when there were very low environmental regulations, even in China back then. So a lot of these establishments, a lot of these refineries has already been constructed. But if you ask the US, you ask Australia, or you ask Europe to really destroy their environmental policies in order to build rare earth plants, refining plants, the answer is a big fat no. So I think Trump has really, I, I, I I don't think the equity stakes things is really going to matter much when it comes to supply chains.
I wanted to ask about the how China might respond to this seizure of Russian sovereign funds, because ever since this proxy war against Russia was triggered in 2014, there's been this efforts to preserve escalation control. That is, to escalate when necessary, de-escalate when required, and in order for us to gradually bleed the Russians of their resources,
Right.
both blood and treasury. But we kind of uh, reach a very critical point now. That is, the war isn't going as well NATO had hoped. The front lines are collapsing. The Europeans are bleeding a lot of money, and there's no more money to fund the war. So it seems that given what's happening on the front, there's massive pressure now for the Europeans to get some new funds, because if they can't take it out of their national budgets. So they have come up with another great idea. A little bit of self-harm involved, but let's just legalize the theft of Russia's sovereign funds, something that wasn't even done during World War II, and here's the plan. They're going to seize this over 200 billion euros and then start to hand it over to Ukraine to fight Russia with its own money. Now, I'm assuming if you sit in China and again, you know that you're next on the chopping block, already the secondary sanctions are going after China. Well, what do you think the Chinese will do? How will they respond to this? Because this is, uh, Nexperia was going after seizing tech companies,
Sure.
but seizing the funding, the money, the sovereign funds. This is,
Right.
I don't think people appreciate how radical this is. What kind of shockwaves do you think this is going to send through the international financial system?
Sure. I think the Chinese also know that they are in a bit of a bind as well, right? China has been de-dollarizing, they've been selling their treasury bonds. But if we look at the official numbers, there's still a boatload of Chinese holdings. Now, if we throw in Hong Kong together with mainland China, they still hold over $1 trillion worth of US Treasury bonds. Now, that is a lot of money. That's at least 3 times more than what the Russians lost. And when it comes to confiscation, well, you can always make the argument that, yeah, maybe China is willing to let go of $1 trillion in order to break the American system. But in a short term, $1 trillion is still a lot of money. Let's say, for example, argument's sake, Washington confiscated, it can always flow into US AI tech. It can always flow into other parts of the American system to subsidize the economy. Now, the thing about this is that it directly works against the Chinese. So, what we can expect China to do over the next few months, over the next few years, is to more aggressively get out of US assets, dump their treasury bonds, let it roll over mature, take the money and invest it into the next battlefront of the future, which is semiconductors, AI tech. Maybe they start building more relations with the African nations, with BRICS, or definitely put some into gold. But I don't think they will want to risk a very long term to be blackmailed by the Americans due to their treasury holdings. And this is why the Chinese, even today, they are still trying to tread a little carefully. They don't want to just, anger Trump and suddenly poof, 1 trillion goes away because it could always happen tomorrow.
It's a gradual decoupling. Yeah.
Right.
Um, well, I guess another challenge there for the Chinese dilemma would be, on one hand, uh, they need to retaliate in the economic war in order to, well, impose some costs on this, but also to push the Americans to reverse some of their decisions. On the other hand, if the Chinese gets too deeply involved in this, in the retaliations, I'm thinking then especially in the restricting the rare earth, they would be seen then possibly as a unreliable or political economic actor by other
Right.
parts of the world. At least this is what the European Union appears to be trying to advertise or market. They keep, every time China responds to any of America's sanctions, the Europeans are saying, "Oh, look, the Chinese are weaponizing supply chains. They're not reliable." Well, okay. With these instances, I think it's quite clear to many that the Americans started this. I mean, Trump, he becomes his worst enemy when he goes out on TV and saying, "Hey, we're gonna have an economic war with China. It's gonna be easy to win." I mean, afterwards, when it goes wrong, it's gonna be very hard to blame China. But
Right.
nonetheless, if China is seen as using economic statecraft too coercively, this will not be good for China either if it wants to be, build trust as a reliable, unpolitical, yeah, administrator of a new economic system.
Right. I think right now it's a big game of there's a mixture of seriousness in it together with a game of bluster because Trump is going to meet President Xi, I think, in a few days' time in South Korea. So both sides they're trying to play their strongest hand. Now, will the rare earth curbs continue? Well, it really depends, right? As you said, the Chinese don't want to be seen as so-called a bad actor and then restricting the world with their rare earth supply. But the Chinese are also concerned about transshipments. I think we can all remember when Biden started restricting AI chips to China, some of the chips eventually did end up in China, right? Maybe it's through third party countries, maybe it's through proxies, but it can always bypass sanctions. So if China does impose this kind of rare earth sanctions or curbs to the Western countries, some of it will naturally get bypassed as well. So China can't just say, oh, we'll supply the Europeans, we'll supply the rest of the world, we're only going to cut out the US because the US most likely they'll try to get supplies from the EU as well. So you're right that China has to play quite a bit of a balancing game. Uh, at this point, right, it all depends on how Trump is going to escalate things. But I think China is going to wrestle with Trump. They're going to ask him for concessions. And I think the crown jewel that China actually wants is for some of the semiconductor curbs, especially buying all those advanced machines from ASML in the Netherlands and Tokyo Electron in Japan to go away. Now, are there other terms and conditions? Maybe, but I don't see China really relaxing, their economic alliance, their economic partnership with Russia. I don't think they're going to stop buying Russian oil.
No, it seems unlikely. But I do think that it's going to be in the short term some disruptions. And again, at the moment, it's important in the West to have some PR victories as well. But this efforts by the United States to capture certain economic regions to well use them to not just cut themselves off from other centers, but also join in on the economic war. I mean, it's a bit like the regular war. It's always good to have your proxies throw yourself at your adversaries, which
Yep.
is I often make the point that with the Russians, the Americans are fighting to the last Ukrainian and to the last euro, and that appears to be what they're doing. But you also see on the other side of the Eurasian continent, that is Japan. They're also being coming under pressure now, aren't they, to join in on America's economic war. So are they also successful in getting the Japanese to cut themselves off from Russia?
Well, I don't think it'll be very successful. Um, I believe that Scott Besson, he actually talked to the Japanese and tried to encourage them to cut away Russian oil. But Japan's economy is in such a horrible state that they just can't do it. Now, 90% of Japan's energy uh, imports, 90% of Japan's energy mix comes from imports, right? They don't really have their own, they're not self sufficient in energy. And a lot of it actually comes from Russia when it comes to LNG. Now, the problem with Japan is that if they actually listen to Americans, they're going to doom themselves long term. Right now, I suspect that the Japanese, they're just playing a very uh, long waiting game. They're hoping for the Trump nightmare to just disappear after 3 to 4 years, and maybe all the tariffs magically go away, and Japanese industries get some breathing room. But if Japan were to follow the Americans, the outcome is going to be quite predictable. A lot of Japanese industries, they won't be able to compete, especially in Asia, when you have China actually clobbering them throughout the supply chains. When it comes to critical industries like EVs, Japan just can't compete. So the only markets left is markets that exclude China. And more likely than not, is going to be the Americans. And we know what Trump wants: build your factories in the US. So if this were to continue for a prolonged period, and cutting off Russian oil is going to accelerate the pain, Japanese industries will have no choice but to move all the way to the West, to the United States, to survive. So this could actually trigger quite a bit of a deindustrialization in Japan, aka Germany style. So I don't think Japan really wants to go down that route, but you never know, right? You just never know.
So yeah, America's frontline states, to use that term, aren't doing very well. But part of the U.S. objective, though, was to well, restore its economic power through different means. That is, weaken its adversaries, primarily China, but also we've seen these efforts to cannibalize some of the allies' markets. That is, when the Germans started going through difficulties with high energy costs, their companies weren't competitive. The Americans went across offering subsidies and to get them across the Atlantic to take over their industries. Trump was very open about his objectives towards Taiwan. He thought their semiconductor industry should be moved over to the United States. So overall, cannibalizing their adversaries. So is this being successful? Because I see now Besant going out on TV saying how extraordinary the economic development is. Of course, part of the game they have to play is build confidence. Uh, but I guess my question, last question, is twofold. Is this cannibalizing the industries of its allies? Is it successful? And how do you then assess the development of the U.S. economy now? Are they able to reverse the decline, or do you just see the foundations being further chipped away at?
Well, if you're talking about the cannibalization of allies, for example, when it comes to Japan, maybe when it comes to Germany and the rest of the EU, I think it's successful to a degree because a lot of these states they still rely a lot on the US consumer market. We are talking about dependency of anywhere from 20% to 40% to 50% of market share in certain cases in certain industries. So no doubt some of EU industries, EU factories, they will have to move to the US to actually stand a chance to survive. But that also brings a very big problem for the entire Western bloc, the entire Western hemisphere. You are hollowing out other parts of your friends, right? I almost say empire, but your friends in order to build up the US economy itself. So what does that mean? It means a lot of prices in the United States will rise, consumers will get weaker, the debt and deficits will continue to grow. Because make no mistakes, you're going to be cut off from a lot of the supply chains in BRICS, especially China, if all the exemptions or the curbs continue to accelerate. So the cost of living and the cost of living in the US will go up, living standards will drop, and that will just destabilize the entire political system and people on the ground. So that isn't very good as well. So if the US were to continue on this path, the entire economy will be even more mired in debt deficits. You can kick the can down for another few decades or decade at the most, but the ensuing boom will be even worse. And when the bust will be even worse, I'm sorry. And when that bust happens, it will be mainly concentrated within the West because now we have a bifurcated world and the world is less connected. So if we do get into a great recession years down the road, it will be the West, especially the US, that will be more affected. If there's a crisis, I think it'll be more of a Western crisis than a global crisis.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Do you see the empire or frontline states? Do you see them reacting or beginning to respond? Well, if you look in Asia, the South Koreans were convinced to make quite a significant investment in the United States, and they end up getting burnt by the Americans themselves. Uh, how has the South Korean, I guess, case developed now? Has there been any changes, or but also, do you follow the internal discourse there in South Korea? Have they kind of learned their lessons, or do they still betting everything on the US?
Well, I think the Koreans, they're not very happy with giving the $350 billion in cash. I think they've mentioned many times that they would rather do a kind of a debt settlement, as in lend the US money and expect it back, right? Whether they get it back is another thing. But I don't think the Koreans really have much of a choice than to be like the Japanese and play the delay game. I think it's just one big kabuki theater, it's one big song and dance to delay Trump, to see how the rest of the world plays out, to see how Trump and China plays out. Because Korea, we know that they sell a lot of chips, a lot of technology exports to the US, and they don't really want to be impacted by huge tariffs. At the same time, Trump already expressed that he wants a lot of chip makers, a lot of semiconductor companies to move to the US. And South Korea doesn't want to suffer that. I don't know whether you can call it indignation or whether you can call it tragedy. It won't be good for the economy. So I think South Korea, like Japan, they're essentially trapped. And the best way to go forward is just to do an elaborate song and dance and hope maybe the US realizes that trade war is actually failing.
Well, this drama keeps going on, as you say, this song and dance. It's quite extraordinary how they went from a few tariffs, and Trump said the whole world will essentially line up to, in his words, kiss his ass.
Right.
But yeah, things aren't really going as expected. I think it was Mike Tyson. He once said, "Everyone has a strategy until they get punched in the face," and it appears the Americans are also getting a good punch in their face at the moment.
Right.
So, anyways, thank you so much for taking the time. I always follow your program. So just a last question: where can people find you? Because I watch your YouTube channel for the excellent analysis.
Yeah. Well, viewers can just go to YouTube, just type in Sean Fu. You can find me. YouTube.com/Sean Fu Gold. I'll be there. We'll do breakdowns on the economy, sometimes geopolitics, gold, finance, and investments as well.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I have to throw in one last question because I was actually I forgot that was the main thing I actually want to ask.
Right.
Gold over $4,000. What?
Right.
I mean, I remember in 2008. That's when I started buying gold because all the well, in the economic trouble caused by too much borrowing and too much spending, the solution was let's borrow more and spend a little bit more. So I thought, with currencies going down, let's buy some gold. But I would not have expected $4,000 back then. People were saying, "Oh, in the future it can go up to 2,000," but here we are passing $4,000. What is happening? How do you explain this? Yeah, gold going through the roof.
Sure. I'll just explain it using one final example, and it's a very good example, right? So we know that the United States they are collecting record amounts of tariffs today, right? Scott Bessent, he went around saying, "Oh, it's fantastic. The U.S. deficit is down. We're collecting a lot of tariffs, but we all know it's just from the Americans themselves, U.S. consumers." But here's the rub: last year's budget deficit was $1.8 trillion. This year, it's still $1.8 trillion, and that's despite record tariffs. That's despite record collections from all the US consumers. So, what does that mean? It means that the spending portion has increased. The interest on the debt has increased as well. We are now at $1 trillion a year. So just think about it. That means that even though the tariff war continues, US spending is still going up. And if by some miracle the tariff war goes away, suddenly you have a lot of revenue collections gone, but the interest on the debt, the spending, all the entitlements, discretionary, mandatory, it's all going up. So you now have an even bigger influx of money chasing fewer assets, whether that's stocks, whether that's gold. So if we are just talking about gold itself, right? Pun intended, the future looks quite bright indeed.
My only regret is not buying more gold. So, anyways, thank you again for taking the time.
No problem. All right. See ya.